So, yes, my name is Ivan Kroupin, and this is TC Chung. We're going to be presenting our sort of theoretical framework and some early work on culture as an additional scale of biological organization, or culture as extended distributed development. Okay, so just brief intro on who we are and sort of where we're coming from. Between the two of us, we have a fairly wide mix of backgrounds: developmental and cross-cultural psychology, sociology, philosophy, genetics, cultural evolution. TC is a PhD student at Harvard. I'm a former PhD student and postdoc at Harvard, now a postdoc at London School of Economics. We both work at an institutionalized field site, which I co-direct on the board of Namibia and Angola, looking at changes from small-scale society groups that are moving into more urban areas, effects of formal education, this kind of thing. And we work jointly on a sort of empirical and theoretical research program concerned with explaining cultural variation from first principles. So there's a lot of concrete projects we're working on. So reinforcement learning and Bayesian frameworks for thinking about cognitive variation across groups, thinking about schooled versus unschooled reasoning, a lot of concrete empirical projects. We'll go into some of this, but this is just an overview of sort of where we're coming from. Okay, so this is going to be first. We're going to run through. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just moving this to.
Okay, that's fine. So we're gonna first run through the whole plan of the talk, where we're gonna go, so we kind of have a high level overview of what's going on. This is part one, so I'll be covering part one principally, and then TC will be covering part two principally, but we'll both kind of jump in as needed. Okay, part one. So first we're going to think about cultural. We want to move towards first principles descriptions of what cultural systems are like, and we're going to move towards the descriptions of cultural systems as self-sustaining processes in behavior space. And of course, we're using a lot of your terminology throughout here. Next, we're going to think about cultural processes we're going to think about the change in historical time in cultural processes. And the claim we're going to make is that the change has to do with modularization and layering of these processes as historical time goes on, and which in terms allows for larger scale organization. Then we're going to argue that this dynamic, this modularization kind of dynamic, is a direct and the kind of view of cultural system as self-sustaining processes is a direct extension of this biological hierarchy that you talk about. So there's a very direct way in which it's just the same set of ideas that kind of perpetuates into a new layer. And finally, part one will focus the upshot of part one is that thinking about culture and historical changes in culture from this perspective gives us a first principles and biologically continuous account for a wide range of social, cultural, material, and cognitive data. So it kind of allows us to explain a lot of space of data from sociologists and cross-cultural psychologists, et cetera, that previously has had no unified kind of way of thinking. So, and we'll present a little bit of that data as well. Okay, TC,
Yeah.
feel free to jump in part two.
So for part two, in part one, we already see how increases in modularization, standardization, and hierarchical organization, they actually help to explain a lot of the data that we see. But there's still the question of why do they happen and how exactly do they happen? Mechanistically, what is going on, for example, in a particular cultural process when it undergoes this kind of modularization and standardization? And the major insight here, so we're going to try to take an initial step at answering this, but of course, this is all work in progress, and we really seek we really seek all of your opinions and thoughts on this, and we really see this as part of a sort of co-thinking process.
Yeah.
The way that we've been thinking about this is that cultural processes niche construct substrates for each other and that promote each other's unfolding, and that this kind of niche construction can sort of assemblages of all these processes that niche construct for each other can happen, and these assemblages can emerge in two ways. One way is holobiontically, like these processes come together and they can recombine and reassort. Another way, however, is that these processes need to be transmitted together. They need to persist in the same set of substrate, be in close proximity with each other. And we sort of see this as this set of ideas is inspired by some of the work that you have done. And as we answer this question, we realize that this can answer a whole bunch of this can give more structure to a whole bunch of theoretical issues that people in the evolutionary social sciences have had for a long time. For example, it's been very difficult to think about why cultural systems can both evolve. There's both evolutionary phenomena, which are produced by natural selection, but there's also learning and agency that takes place in social structure. Like, how do these two things actually interdigitate? to produce structure and function in society. And so the upshot of this part is that we can give a first principles account of the nature of what cultural systems are, how they relate and mobilize their substrate, and why different societies have different cultural systems have evolved differently. Yeah.
Okay, so that's our big overview plan. Just to also put out right away kind of the aims we'd like to have in this sort of talk and discussion broadly from our end, is just to bring out this conceptual framework and get your input, because a lot of these ideas we believe connect directly to yours, and we'd love your thoughts at a broader sort of level of how they connect. There's some potential projects that we think come out of this, if they are of mutual interest. In particular, making part two into a paper we think is an interesting avenue to explore, but we'll of course get there when we get there. And then looking ahead, I think that there's some potentially interesting empirical work across scales. Okay, so to finally get to where we're going, part one, cultural cognitive systems. Okay, so first, just motivating why we should be interested in cultural systems and the fundamental phenomenon we're interested in here. So TC and I have been, from different angles, we converged on an interest in this really broad historical change from small scale societies. This is actually a drone shot from the field site where we work, from humans all living in small scale societies to this massive increase of scale and literally biomass in the human population, to most of us living in these large urban conurbations. So there's this overall change is related to a bunch of different sort of indicators: increased social mobility, increased social scale, much more complex and layered technology, increasing layers of complexity of institutions, literacy, numeracy, science, schooling, etc. And this kind of trajectory and change has been identified by everybody since forever, right? Sociologists, philosophers, whoever you want to cite. Joe Henrich, both of whom TC is still Joe's PhD student, I was his postdoc, has recently written a broad account of this kind of change as well. There's also a parallel track of changes in individual psychology that accompanies this shift, right? And it's seen across the board in cognitive science concepts, from constructs, from IQ to executive function to relational reasoning, formal logic, forms of categorization, forms of memory, model-based versus model-free thinking, visual perception, etc. You get stark differences in how individuals perform on measures of all of these things between small-scale societies and larger urban zones. More specifically, this is often tied to differences between informal apprenticeship as a more mode of learning, where you just grow up in a village and you become part of that village, versus formal schooling as a discrete setting for learning. And we'll come to why formal schooling is particularly interesting from our framework. But the generalization here seems to be that across this change, you get this increase in abstract context-independent information processing, abilities or dispositions to engage in this kind of thing. So this has been studied by many people, and there's a huge trove of evidence historically on this kind of thing. So this is the overall pattern we're interested in. There seems to be something really big going on, this kind of shift. And one thing to say is that none of this, it's really important to say that this is not progress in any sense. I mean, there's no claim that this is an improvement in the human condition. There's certainly downsides to this kind of shift. We have worse mental health, it seems like, than people in small scale society. We're definitely worse on the ecology. But this is objectively happening, this kind of shift. Okay, so why we care is understanding culture is this bogeyman of psychology, right? So it clearly has huge effects, but cognitive science has gone out of its way to avoid talking about culture. And recently I published a paper with Joe kind of trying to explain why that might be the case. To some extent, culture is also a bogeyman in biology, because clearly these are living systems, but how exactly do you characterize cultural systems qua living systems? There's been major progress in all these kind of departments, but still accounts of culture tend to be either purely verbal or disconnected from any sort of first principles frameworks. So what we want to do here is make steps towards the general account. The problem one, having motivated why we care about all this stuff, how do we move towards a first principle definition of cultural systems? All right, so cultural systems are biological systems, right? These are living systems. They're composed of living parts. The problem is that they have no body, which is often a reference point for thinking about biology. they seem to occupy and make use of very diverse substrates. So on one hand, definitely human behaviors are part of cultural systems, but then there's tools, there's institutions, there's family relations, technology, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a weird kind of unit. The move what we want to make to paint cultural systems as a coherent type of thing is to shift our perspective to not to entities, but to processes. And this is very aligned with many of the ways you've talked about biology. The point being that we want to talk about the way that we can unify across all of these substrates is to think about cultural systems as stable processes at multiple level. Um, i.e., structures like dynamic structures which are self-sustaining given the appropriate environmental affordances. So from this perspective, human behaviors, material culture, technology, all this kind of stuff, they're all just varieties of affordances that cultural processes require to maintain themselves. And these structures, again, using your terminology, are solving problems in a particular space. So just briefly, this kind of perceptual view is very familiar to you. We can think of from like a biology example. We can think of a cell as a material unit, but really, in some sense, a cell more fundamentally is a series of processes that are maintaining themselves and drawing what they need from the environment, from environmental affordances, in order to maintain this series of processes, right?
Mhm.
Um, and we can think of cultural systems in a similar way. So, for example, like a ritual, a marriage ritual, which persists across time, is a persistent process that continuously draws on affordances from its environments and constructs affordances in its environment, as we're going to see later, in order to persist across time. We can also think about social roles, like an HR professional has the same type, can be thought of as the same type of structure. The use of standardized letters or numbers or whatever, again, is a type of process. The use of these sort of symbols in a particular way is a type of process that is independent of the specific substrate, but has a certain set of affordances that it requires in order to persist. Okay, so we're taking this process view on culture, and if we think about biological systems generally from this process view, we can actually think of cultural systems kind of neatly emerging as just another form of stable process, right? It's got peculiarities, and its substrate is sort of counterintuitive to us because we occupy an odd position relative to the substrate here. But just from a process point of view, it seems pretty continuous, or that's the argument we like to make. And so this historical change that we're talking about can be thought of as just further increasing layers of these kinds of processes that actually are continuous with increasing layers of organization processes occurring at different levels of biology. So the next question is, what is the space in which, so if cultural processes are this kind of problem, this kind of persisting processes that are solving problems in a kind of space, what is the space in which they're operating? And for now, we're calling this, and we realize that the terminology will probably need to be improved here, but what we're calling this behavior space, right? So it's not just human behaviors, but it's the full sort of set of affordances that cultural systems tend to use, right? So it's definitely human behaviors, but this also involves the kind of preconditions for the behaviors that are human internal cognitive organization, the availability of certain tools, the availability of certain infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so yes, this kind of follows from what we've already been saying. And again, we'll come back to so okay, so this is just step one. All right, we're defining cultural systems as self-sustaining processes in this sort of behavior space. Um, Problem two for this project. How do cultural system processes increase in scale across historical time? So what's the dynamic? What's the nature of the dynamic here? Well, okay, so the shift from small scale societies to large scale societies, again, not a question of progress. Though, if we kind of turn this whole model on the side and think about where is this going in terms of evolutionary time, uh, the question we want to ask is what is changing, and our hypothesis is that what were previously relatively variable processes become modularized and standardized as they become part of a larger, higher order process. So the biological analogy here that you've demonstrated beautifully is cells becoming part of tissues. So cells, individual cell behaviors are variable relative to the kind of modularized and standardized behaviors that they engage in once they become part of the processes of larger tissue systems. And so the idea here is that this historical change across in cultural systems has the same basic structure, that what's going on is that previously variable processes becoming modularized, standardized, and incorporated into larger scale things. And here there's a lot of sort of details, and we can certainly go into them. This isn't just, again, it's not just human behaviors. So one of the ways that this works is that previously human behaviors become packaged into technologies, and that facilitates their standardization. So those processes that were variable by virtue of being done by humans become built into a machine and then become much more standardized. As I say, there's more details, but that's the basic hypothesis of what's going on here. Um, Again, we see this as a direct extension of the kind of stuff you talk about in terms of modular structure within organism level biology. Um, and the term we've been using to describe the difference between cultural systems that are relatively sort of at the first layers of this type of organization to relatively higher levels is a difference in depth of standardization. Our rule of thumb for describing this stuff has been like, if you think about any given object, you can think about how many standard processes had to happen for you to use it. So for a flint knife, basically none. You get the flint, you nap it, you use the knife. To use a MacBook, like the number of the layers of standard processing are crazy, from mineral extraction to processing, whatever. So we have clear differences in terms of that standardization across these groups. BC,
Yeah.
you want to take this? Relative.
So here are just some examples to illustrate these differences in depth of standardization and some of the differences in sort of from a cognitive point of view, the kinds of information processing that you have to do, but also in terms of the behavior of the tools themselves, how they interact with each other, how decontextualized and compositional they are in terms of the behavior of the tools. So one can compare, for example, flint knapping to sorry, to building something in Minecraft. So these involve very, very different kinds of physical manipulations. One can imagine, for example, making a bed out of raw materials in a sort of traditional carpentry versus assembling furniture that you purchase from IKEA. Think about how communicable the skills are. Think about how heterogeneous versus homogeneous the kinds of behaviors are. One could think about, maximizing your basket of goods, be they social or material goods, in a traditional sort of exchange ceremony, let's say a potlatch, versus, Bitcoin trading, right? So we can see how the skills change over time because the systems change over time. And there's also a hierarchical aspect of this because when we look at these are actually the culture that the Himba women engaging in traditional construction of their houses, there isn't a lot of layers of hierarchy in terms of the different processes that are taking place. But this is quite different, for example, when we are thinking about building a cathedral, where there's abstractions like columns, stories that exist at multiple levels. There's often a bureaucracy that manages the entire construction process, which once again have to deal with different abstractions at different levels, different kinds of standardization at different levels. And so, why does this happen? We think that it's because when you actually look at what tools are doing, for example, carrying a basket of apples versus carrying apples with your bare hands, catching butterflies with a net versus catching a butterfly with your bare hands, or catching a mouse using a trap versus catching a mouse with your bare hands, both physical and social tools, stuff like bureaucracies and so on and so forth, can act in this Markov blanket kind of way, which is using some of the terminology from your work. They allow skills to be chunked and to be represented abstractly in a way that was not actually possible before. Yeah. So
Okay.
this naturally.
Yeah. So the proposal here, again, kind of zooming out, is that, all right, we're interested in these increases in scale and all the concomitant stuff that's going on there, social, material, and psychological. Increases in scale require these increases in depth of standardization. And again, the claim here is general, that in living systems generally, this is the type of thing that's happening. And what we describe this at the cultural level as is a rich, lean shift. So we've been describing these smaller scale societies with more kind of less modular and hierarchically organized processes as richer societies, and then leaner societies are the ones with the greater depth of standardization. So this has gotten us through cultural processes have become modularized and layered across historical time. And the claim here is that this is a direct extension of how what's going on organism level biology. Okay, so now we try to map some of this to data. And I'm going to move a little bit quickly because we're moving towards the half points. Again, this is the data that we're interested in, this huge body of work from various disciplines about this type of general type of change, which maps onto these increasing layers of organization in various ways. And then there's something equivalent going on the cognitive side. So what? So one way of kind of approaching this is to think, okay, where did this all start? At the first layer, so let's just start where this first type of this layer of organization emerged in the first place in small scale societies. What you can imagine prior to modularization and layering, what you would expect at this kind of first layer is a kind of integrated, like these processes should all be very context specific, integrated, boutique. They all grew up in this. There's not a lot of kind of recombination and compositionality yet. And so what you might expect is kind of them being built into very specific environments. And here, for example, is this is from the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, who talks about he worked with the Kabyle people in Northern Africa, and this is just their map of how they think about their life, basically. And for them, everything is very interrelated. The harvest is related to birth, is related to dry and wet seasons, all this kind of stuff. And their processes and practices are also very interrelated for them internally, cognitively, and they literally have dependencies in terms of how these processes interact with one another. Um, and then what happens if we go up the sort of depth of standardization or modularity and layering scale? Well, you end up with compositional, discrete, general purpose patterns across domains. So for example, here's a school schedule, right? And it's just sort of visible, the difference in structure. You have this discrete compositional organization of activities. Each activity can be replaced by a different activity. They slot in and out. They're completely separable from one another, et cetera, et cetera. So what our claim is that it's basically reflecting exactly this kind of dynamic. And well, I won't spend time on this. This is from a review of the effects of formal schooling on cognition that is a preprint of ours now. And this just contrasts traditional education versus formal schooling in exactly this kind of set of differences. Okay, so social material patterns change. This is what the claim here is that what we're seeing is this change in sort of layers of modularity and organization. This has gotten us to social material data very generally. What about cognitive data? Well, basically, again, very briefly, the human mind is the most adaptive sort of cognitive system we know about. Maybe we'll invent some other ones soon, but for the time being, it's the most adaptive one we know about. And so if there are these very systematic changes in the organization of the cultural system where we are interfacing with, we should expect internal equivalence. So in a recent paper, we've talked about this as articulation between cognitive systems and their environments, but the principle is kind of very straightforward. The claim here briefly is, and we're working on models of this both from the Bayesian and reinforcement learning perspective at the moment, but you would predict that in a modular, hierarchically structured type of environment, you would get changes that correspond to this kind of to what is observed in the psychological literature. So what you're going to get are cognitive systems that are better at detecting discrete games within the environment and not assuming that they're related to everything else around them, and then have a kind of a stash of moves of how to maneuver within these discrete games that they identify, right? And this is going to apply from everything from IQ tests to like going to a new store and buying, like you've never been to Best Buy before, but you know this is going to be a discrete game. You know the kind of thing that you should be looking for. Whereas that kind of discretization of the environment and applying abstract sort of ideas of how to solve different games is just not efficient in a small scale society. You're going to cut out context that's important for your social interactions or whatever. So again, this sort of falls straight out of the predictions of our overall accounts. I'm going to really briefly go through some examples from cross-cultural psychology. We can go almost to any length with these. There's a huge volume of them. But the first one is kind of nice because it's from Alexander Luria. Very possibly you know this. This is the basic syllogism test that he was administering to schooled and non-schooled populations. The question is, all bears in the north are white. Nowe Zemlya is in the north. What color are the bears in Nowe Zemlya? school populations uniformly respond white. Non-school populations overwhelmingly respond, I don't know, I've never been there, or something along those lines. So the school populations is discretizing this piece of information using only the premises and answering within the context, whereas the non-school population is treating this as a broader, it's just integrated with the rest of our conversation. And you're some guy that's shown up from Moscow and you're asking me about bears, and I'm trying my best to satisfy your curiosity. And you get this in all sorts of cognitive tasks. So this is a task, this is from
Sorry,
game.
could I ask a question? On the
Yeah,
previous one, what kind of instructions are they given before this? What are they told about this? Anything?
nothing. So this is just like this is they're entered into conversation. At most they might be told that this is a puzzle. I don't remember if they prefaced it with this, but mostly they were just sitting around the kind of whatever
Okay,
campfire.
yeah, I was just curious if they were given any instructions to sort of believe the first statement, as in like assume this is correct and then go from there. Was it? But nothing like that was said.
No, no,
Okay,
yeah. So exactly, this is testing a disposition kind of
okay, all right.
their dispositional treatment of this kind of information, and that there's a whole rabbit hole about the differences between dispositions and capacities and how they relate to
Got
this.
it.
But to your point, Paul Harris later ran a study with his colleagues where if you preface this kind of thing with imagine a world where,
Yeah,
then the non-school populations are performing basically the same way as school populations. That's
interesting.
doing exactly that thing where it's like it discretizes it sort of not mechanically, but it discretizes the problem from their lived experience, and then they work through the logic.
Interesting. Okay.
But it's not always just dispositions. So here, there's the game is you get four cards, and you need to sort them into two piles by some dimension. So it can be color, number, shape. You make one sort, and then you're asked to resort them to a different dimension. Then you're asked to resort them to a different dimension. School populations, this is trivial. Kids by the age of 4 have no problem with this. Non-school populations, adults struggle very significant, right? So I keep forgetting to put the percentages on this slide, but it's something like it's only 70% that are doing the second sort, and then there still, I forget how many, there's a substantial percentage that aren't getting to the third sort either. So you have a real difficulty in getting, and this is with repeated demonstrations and instructions and explanations, et cetera, et cetera. Still, it's just something about this concept that's not coming across to them. This is work from Gay and Cole back in 1967. Just to give an example from some of our work, this is a study on a very, very, very common executive function task that I ran in Bolivia and the field site Namibia and Angola. This is in collaboration with Helen Davis, who I co-direct the Namibian field site with, but also Joe Henrik and Emily Burdett. Basically, the task is you match first. The kids see a box with a blue rabbit, a box with a red boat. Then they get cards with blue boats and red rabbits. First we play, and then you tell them first we play the color game. In the color game, blue goes with blue, red goes with red. They do 6 trials of that. After that, you say, stop. We are not playing the color game anymore. Now we're playing the shape game. In the shape game, rabbits go with rabbits, boats go with boats. So stimuli stay the same, but the mapping of the dimensions switches. This is like an uber classic executive function task in the West. Kids in the West are before the age of 4 or 5, they tend to perseverate. So even though you told them to switch dimensions, they continue matching on the original dimension. And these are our results from the cross-cultural population. So we replicate in the UK, we replicate the classic finding since forever that kids by age 5 are at ceiling. And then we get massive cross-cultural variation. And especially in non-school populations, right? Bolivia is this long and funny, not funny, it's a complicated story. They're sort of semi-schooled. Schooled Kunene kids are living in Namibia and Angola, but they're going to school from the villages. And then unschooled Kunene are folks with non-literate, no exposure to formal schooling. And so the way that we would interpret this is that this is another piece of evidence that this kind of extracting a discrete structure from the environments, identifying the rules, and being comfortable with the rules being arbitrary and switchable is an adaptation to an environment which is built out of layered modular systems where you're going to run across this stuff all the time, where you're constantly interacting with these modular kind of processes which require switching between rule sets pretty flexibly. And so there's like if a 15-year-old failed this task in the US, you should be worried. I mean, it would be really a massive outlier. But the Kunene kids, they're herding like at 15, they're herding hundreds of cattle. Like they have no problems, right? It's not an issue. They're not like cognitively delayed for their environments. But what their adaptations are seem to be really very different. And again, we would claim align with this broader account. All right, for sake of time, I'm gonna skip this one. This is just another example, kind of in the same vein. Here's another chart from that, or another table from that, the review of formal schooling, which is just gestures towards this being a really huge literature. Everything from Piagetian tasks to any number of cognitive tasks to the conditioning tasks from the animal literature. All of them basically show these kind of systematic differences in the same direction. Finally, just to review, to jump to another domain. So you get all these cognitive effects, right, in terms of how people are performing on tasks. But the account we're describing, the processes we're describing, the cultural, the biological units we're describing, these cultural processes, they're indifferent to domain in the way that we think about domain. So they want modularity and organization and affordances that are going to have this structure across the environment, across the space they're solving problems in generally. So we may predict that you're going to get this not only in terms of the problems that people encounter when they're solving them, but even the material culture we interact with should have this modular, layered kind of structure. And in fact, it sort of kind of clearly does in some sense, or at least intuitively it seems to, right? In small scale societies, there are almost no repeating forms. You have relatively few types of objects, but the tokens of the object are variable, right? Every house is a little bit different. Every knife is a little bit different. Whereas we live in a world with endless types, but very high within type homogeneity. And so one might expect that this will have predictable consequences for something like your adaptation to the visual system. And the most salient, perhaps, symptom of this kind of layered modular compositional structure are 90-degree angles. It's just much easier to build with them, right? It's a much easier type of structure to utilize. And if we look around, and if you look around, you'll see an endless number of 90-degree angles. In small scale societies, there are basically none of them, or none that are perfect, and those that are there, they don't repeat all that often. Okay, so this is a study of visual perception that I did again at the field site with Michael Mythkrishnan, who's a professor at LSE, Talia Konkel, who's a vision professor here at Harvard, and again, Helen Davis, as always. So this is a visual illusion. It's called the Coffer illusion. I don't know if you've seen it before, but usually, I'm sure you see rectangles here. Do you see circles in the image?
Only once you've mentioned it. As soon as you said it, I couldn't see it until you said it.
Okay, yeah. So, but and some people have a really hard time seeing them. Most people actually do. As I'll show, there's a subset of the population that's kind of has your pattern where it's quite quick to notice circles. But generally speaking, it's hard for us to see these circles. But the prediction is here. This is an ambiguous stimulus where there's two competing percepts, one of which involves the detection of right angles. So the prediction here is fairly straightforward. Like if we live in right-angled worlds, we should be more likely to see them. Here's the data from this visual illusion, right? So there's three populations, UK, US, standard sample, Apuo, which is the town we work in the field site. So it has some structured stuff, but it's still, so it's much less structured than the UK, US population, but much more so than the villages where there's really no kind of industrial style buildings. Pattern of data, so there's four possible response types to this illusion. You can see only the rectangles and not spontaneously see the circles. So if I ask you, what do you see? Rectangles, do you see anything else? You say no. The other type is, what do you see? You say rectangles. You see anything else? Pause, and then you say circles, right? So you spontaneously see circles. And then you just have the reverse patterns. You could see circles first, and then if spontaneously see rectangles, you could see only circles. This is the UK US data, which we've replicated actually a couple of times as well since then. Overwhelmingly only rectangles, substantial minority see rectangles and circles spontaneously. A few people circles rectangles, 0 people in a 300-person sample see circles only. And then you just get a sort of wildly different pattern in the town and even more so in the village. So this is a very different, and then we've also, so since then we've expanded, oh, by the way, and since then we've started running visual statistics. So this is through Talia, just visual statistics of the environment. So we've done it in UK, US, and a pool so far. And this is just a Fourier transform where the more signal you have on the axes, the more 90 degree, basically 90-degree and 180-degree lines you have. Very strong signal in Western context. And then a pool is just like you can tell that it's much smaller. We don't have all the images we need for the villages yet, but presumably it's going to be even lower, right? And so we're working on building a model that would actually like reproduce these data from the input. We've also now done a bunch of other illusions, which I'm not going to go into because we're running out of time, but the result is consistent. So basically these kinds of shapes and regular shapes that we seem to be very good at inferring, and you would predict we'd be good at inferring because of the structure of our world, they don't actually crop up in illusions. Okay, so that's part one. We're running a little bit late, but we'd love if you have any sort of comments or questions so far. Happy to pause for the moment.
Yep, no, it's all good. It's all good. Keep going.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right,
okay.
TC.
Okay, so I will try to move through this as fast as possible, but it's potentially the case that we might still have quite a lot of content. So just raising if you would like to continue the conversation, I hope we will have a chance to do that.
Sure.
So we have seen that there are these differences in depth of standardization, but what are the evolutionary dynamics that actually drive this? How does this look like? So this is an incomplete account because it's our first attempt to come up with something like this. But really, the background is just niche construction. All these different processes can niche construct structure into different substrates, into the resources that other processes have to use. And these can be affordances that exist in the psychological realm, in the physical world, in social norms, in social structure, so on and so forth. And therefore, these affordances can be divided into internal and external forms. And the main point is that assemblages of mutually niche constructing cultural processes can adapt. They can attain their adaptive capacity in two different ways. In one way, there is community assembly and sort of just selection kind of operating. In the other way, there is something that is more similar to a developmental process, and we think this actually corresponds to the rich-lean distinction that we set up in the previous section. And here's how we would go through this logic. The first part, we will just see some examples of how standardized cultural processes have emerged evolved culturally over time. Some examples and some themes of this. And then after that, we're going to cover, in a very quick overview, the evolutionary forces and dynamics behind holobiosis and autobiosis. And then after that, we're going to take a deeper look at holobiosis and autobiosis. These words, by the way, especially autobiosis, is really a neologism. And we are trying to figure out how to talk about this in a quite short way. So how do standardized cultural processes emerge? Some examples. Increases in scale of cultural processes require standardization of lower level cultural processes. We already saw some examples of this in the previous section. Some examples that we're going to see now are in symbolic communication, the move from informal mnemonic sign systems to standardized sign systems of communicative signs. The best example of this is writing. Another one is in the realm of economic exchanges. So from a move from barter between sort of highly heterogeneous and idiosyncratic baskets of goods to money. There's also a movement from traditional systems of local navigational problem solving in less formally regularized landscapes to, for example, an urban environment with a lot of standardized roads with address systems that you can actually street signs and so on and so forth that you can navigate using something like Waymo, for example, a relatively inflexible algorithm. And there's a move from traditional building methods. So these are actually West Andean stones. Every stone is carved in a bespoke way to building out of bricks and mortar. And we're going to go deeper into one of these examples, which is the evolution of writing of physical symbolic communication systems that have been investigated extensively by anthropologists. On one end of the sort of non-standardized to standardized spectrum, you have the use of private signs. So this is signs that a person carves into a physical substrate for their own memory. They're putting this down so that they can remember this themselves later on. Moving to a slightly more, generalizable, use of signs, you have informal signs used, for example, in Aboriginal sand drawing, which they do when they're telling stories. So a whole group of people share a sign system. Then you move on to semi-formal science like shamanic writing, which you find, for example, in Native Americans and as well as in ancient Chinese shamans. That's actually the origin of the Chinese logographic writing system. And you have token systems in trade. So all these clay tokens that you see Mesopotamian traders use, they would wrap up these tokens in clay, they would fire the clay, and when goods change hands across a distance, they would break the seal to see, if the numbers tally. And last of all, you have standardized science systems like written communication, right? And so what are the properties that actually lead to one of these sort of being more, standardized than the other, used in a more standardized way, namely used in a more decontextualized and compositional way? One of these is that in one case, the use of the signs are highly bound to a specific context. In order to use a sign, to deploy it, and for the use of the sign to spread, you have to know the very specific contextual details of how actually the sign was deployed. This is the case. This is the most intense for private signs, and it steadily gets less and less the case as you move to standardized sign systems. So you move from bound signs to you move from the usage of bound sign systems to eventually unbound sign systems. And we see similar processes taking place in all of these other examples that we were talking about. And what this causes is that you have different higher level cultural processes that share parts, which are sort of component cultural processes that are recombined repeatedly over the course of behavior. So in communication, we saw that as you move towards more and more standardized sign systems, you have shared meaning subsets that are reused frequently across communicative acts within a population, and that these meanings can be interpreted without reference to specific contextual details. For money, you see that more and more exchanges take place with these intermediary transactions that take place, for example, in and out of cigarettes. So cigarettes emerge as currency very frequently in prisons, for example, and eventually that takes on a bigger and bigger role within the whole exchange economy. Within navigation, we see that once roads and so on and so forth have been built, there's increasing numbers of movement steps that are shared between members of a population, and of course in construction you have interchangeable components. And so what this causes is that you get increasing numbers of interchangeable subcomponent cultural processes that come in types, basically, that are in some sense homogeneous with respect to the higher level cultural process. And we see this happening actually in all of the examples that we described previously. So the problem we start with is this immediately faces us with a second problem, which is under what conditions does this kind of standardization emerge in a cultural system? Because all the examples we saw, it's not true that all societies use standardized writing systems, right? So clearly there are some conditions which push towards, that type of outcome and some processes that don't. So we have to address the question of what are some of the forces that drive these different patterns of evolution in cultural systems. And one solution that we've been thinking about is a distinction between what we call autobiosis and holobiosis. So this is all very new, and we're just interested in what you think about this. We were very inspired by your way of thinking about evolution and development as two routes to functional structure that, in some sense, there's some abstract sense in which they're equivalent and that they can interdigitate in complex ways. And basically, in holobiosis, where most of the adaptation emerges from selection processes, what happens is you have this ocean of heterogeneous cultural processes, and they give rise to higher level cultural processes that constantly reuse parts. And the parts survive as types, and this requires large numbers of standardized interchangeable processes with respect to the higher level process. So that's like, for example, the use of each letter, for example. The handwriting can be a little bit different, the glyph can be a little bit different, but from the point of view of the linguistic communication process, it's not that important. But for, more informal sign systems, any kind of difference between symbols can play a role, right? So it doesn't have the same quality. On the other hand, you can have autobiosis, where you have bodies of cultural processes that can only persist together. And this collective set contains sort of very complicated internal patterns of interdependencies. They drive increased agency in the substrate that it mobilizes, and the processes can and must deform in the presence of each other, so they are actually less standardized. So this is a high level overview, but now we're going to go through sort of like the nitty-gritty of this. But as we go through that, we also realize, as we were thinking through this, that this way of thinking about cultural processes also lets us answer yet another set of questions, which is in what sense are human cultures superorganisms? This can lead to sort of a general theory for how structure and function in cultural and organismic systems emerges from the same processes, the same forces, and in a continuous way. And, from what angles should you look at human cultural systems to see sort of their organismic nature? Because this has always been a very confusing thing to evolutionary social scientists. Basically, evolutionary social scientists have always divided into two groups. This is, of course, a massive oversimplification, but you do see these two streams. There's one group who would think of culture as genetics or culture as evolving gene pools. Cultures are populations of different sort of cultural traits, cultural variants. Variation comes from mutation, and adaptation comes from cultural selection, which is a kind of natural selection over the cultural gene pool. But there's a different group that sees cultures as social systems that are, in some sense, superorganisms. These superorganisms can emerge, grow, senesce, and die. And adaptation comes from agential processes such as development to growth, learned responses. And the cultural or superorganism has internal structures with functions. And these two different traditions, they have lots and lots of different social scientists, sociologists, anthropologists who have supported them. And they go back to quite far. So you can see as far back as Khaldun, there is more of this like organismic idea. And nowadays we have more in sort of canonical cultural evolution in anthropology as a scientific field, there's more of a culture as genetics idea. So how can this tension be resolved? We think combining the processual view of culture and holobiosis and autobiosis, both of which were inspired by your ideas, we can sort of resolve this tension because both processes are taking place to shape culture. And so now we can go dig a little bit deeper into niche construction. So yeah, we're first going to dig into niche construction and then after that holobiosis and autobiosis. So the important thing about culture is that the cultural processes are distributed. They involve multiple substrates that can be separated in space and time, not necessarily in the body that can count as a single unit. And this means that lots and lots of different cultural processes can reuse and share the same substrate, which means that niche construction forces are they're especially intense. This is especially the case in individual human minds, for example. Cultural processes that have to activate individual human activities in order to proceed, they're all sharing the same substrate. So the kind of mutual niche construction effect is very, very powerful. So in biology, we have here we can draw an analogy between biology and culture, where in biology you have interdependent autocatalytic chemical processes in a cell, or alternatively at the origins of life. All the different chemical processes sort of generate the parts for each other, or at least furnish the conditions for one another to take place. In culture, one analogy that we can provide is if you imagine, one example that we can provide is that if you can imagine a cultural group that only has the nail use, nail production process versus a hammer use and hammer production process. Clearly, if you have both of these cultural processes taking place within the society, the combination of these two will persist better than if only one of them was available. And we have cargo cults, right? Cargo cults are a great example of there's some cultural processes that go in, but because the overall sort of infrastructure, the overall sort of niche construction process, the whole system is not there. Therefore, it cannot sustain itself within the culture that is being influenced. So what are these substrates? Can we go into these substrates in greater detail? We can divide, just like the distinction that we raised previously between internal and external, we can divide them into sort of mental substrates and physical social substrates. For mental substrates, cultural processes can shape and alter, attention, representation, the kinds of concepts that you have, which affect how learnable different cultural activities are. They can also affect motivation, right? They can spark affective states, motivational states. Different cultural processes can engineer different goals. This means that, for example, when culture can shape the social and physical environment to create opportunities to spark the deployment of some process, like, for example, nails and hammers do for one another, that's an interdigitation between how the external environment is shaped and how the mental substrates are shaped. And of course, there's other energetic things that have to be shaped and so on and so forth. So from the point of view of the cultural process, these are all structured substrates containing these affordances that help the process to persist in its unfolding. And different cultural processes can compete with each other for the substrate, or they can facilitate one another. And yet more examples. So we already saw hammer use and nail use.
Yeah.
Should we move to
Yeah,
questions
no,
now?
Maybe just get to Autobiosis. I think
Okay.
examples we've gone through.
Yeah. So toolkits and industries are they're just massively expanded examples of hammers and nails. And then but you also have social behaviors, right? A very quick one, which I think you would be very familiar with, game theoretic social behavior. So tit for tat. If somebody manifests this behavior, other people are sort of forced to driven into that state. But there's also lots of other things like high intensity kinship norms that cause the persistence of ethnic and caste networks. So a whole bunch of different behaviors persist together. Personalistic norms, here you see Putin with his judo buddy who continue to dominate Russia. So when you have personalistic norms, this will lead to personalistic networking behavior. And cultural processes can also the different cultural processes can exist at different levels, right? At more concrete or abstract. And for abstract is things like science or the nation or the space race or something like that. So those actually need to mobilize the more concrete processes for their persistence. Okay, autobiosis, holobiosis. So quickly, so in autobiosis, what happens is the archetypical case is multicellular organisms. Adaptation comes from developmental-like processes, agency among fixed partners. Adaptation takes place through development and learning, and the adaptation emerges through tokens surviving. But then when you look at holobiosis, the archetypical case is microbial communities. Agency comes from selection-like processes like a community assembly. Adaptation emerges at the ecosystem level through multi-level selection, and types survive. So in culture, we can see both kinds of processes taking place. An example of a more autobiotic kind of process is a single KFC surviving and persisting over time by modifying its offerings, staff numbers, hours, physical interior community activities. So the substrates, the people psychology, physical and social processes, they are like being modified in situ. There's like a certain there's a certain token that is being modified. But then more holobiotic is the fast food industry in a whole region surviving and persisting over time. KFC's a whole bunch of KFCs in Boston can be flexibly replaced by Wendy's, Applebee's, Chipotle, Subway. Fast food professionals, vendors, and machines are constantly circulating between the stores, that constantly reassemble and assemble them. And because under autobiosis, you have more quote unquote if you can imagine this sort of not just taking place with the fast food industry, but with like culture in general. So all kinds of different cultural processes across physical, across mental substrates, then we loop back into rich and lean, because in autobiotic processes, the processes have to be deformed under the power of the agential substrate, which is the human mind, together with the other cultural processes and how they have built the mind, to develop a rich set of interdependencies so that the collective persists. But then for the lean kind of adaptation, the processes can be executed by humans or organizations in a very context-free way. They're solving a very small problem. And the overall adaptation takes place from sort of reassembling all these problem-solving devices into sort of this larger structure.
So just briefly, like the survival of a small-scale society versus like a market.
Yeah, like a market system. Yeah, so here we have more examples, like a vertically integrated firm is more autobiotic, supply chains and industry is more holobiotic, a firm itself is more autobiotic, industrial civilization is more holobiotic, kinship group clan gangs are more autobiotic, and personal organizations together with their roles, like HR professional managers, workers are more holobiotic. The House of Saud is very autobiotic, and the social media platform is very holobiotic. And as can be expected, the relationships between people in the House of Saud, they involve a very different psychology than the relationships between people in a social media platform. And this goes again to what we talked about previously, decontextualization, compositionality, and this kind of Markov blanketing process. And so we actually go back to the rich lean
as a description
of this spectrum. Yeah. So we were thinking that so this is all very, very preliminary, and we have no idea whether or not this makes sense. We are not sure how to formalize any of this. So we just think that it will be amazing to chat with you further and to really just sort of co-brainstorm and work through some of these ideas. We are very curious about your thoughts. And especially and the goal would be to reach a scale-free and substrate-free kind of description of standardized cultural processes emerging from non-standardized ones that links it to biology. And we also have some other questions,
But
like for example,
let's let him comment.
Okay, go back.
Yeah, sorry. That was more material than we thought. Yeah, bit of a
Super.
whirlwind.
Yeah, super. Thanks so much. It's very interesting stuff. We'll make another meeting and we'll dig into it.
Okay. Is that
Yeah.
the